Hello and welcome back to the Purposeful Shift. I'm Emma Bryant and I am really glad that you have chosen to spend some time with me today. In today's episode, I would like to talk to you about looking stupid and some reflections which I have had lately about where those thoughts initiated and where they have taken me. So a few weeks ago, I was watching a YouTube video. I honestly cannot remember what it was about or even who made it to give them credit, but I do remember one thing. Somebody in the video was walking past wearing a hoodie with a sentence printed across the front of it that immediately caught my attention, because that sentence was, "Your fear of looking stupid is holding you back." And I found myself pausing the video and reading that sentence again. And I don't think it was because I completely agreed with the sentence, but because I wondered how much truth there was in it. And it kind of hit me, it stopped and it made me think. And a few days later, that sentence was actually still on my mind. I'd literally been carrying it around in my head for days, and it kept popping back into my mind while I was walking the dogs or doing some work or driving somewhere or even just making the dinner. And I started thinking about my own life and all of the things that I've done over the last few years that have felt uncomfortable, like starting this podcast earlier in the year. And more recently, even just recording Instagram videos of myself where I'm talking to the camera. It just felt silly and vain, and talking publicly about running retreats, all of those things make me feel uncomfortable. Even recording video for the podcast alongside this audio still makes me feel a little uncomfortable. And I'm not actually recording video today because I'm not feeling very well. So that just shows that I am still avoiding being uncomfortable at times. But I realized that in most of these situations, I wasn't actually afraid of doing the thing. I'm not afraid of pressing record. I'm afraid of what somebody else might think of me because I'm doing them. And of course, that's quite different. So when I stop and I really think about it, I'm not worried about recording video for this podcast. I'm not worried about talking to a camera on Instagram. I've stood up on stages and talked to hundreds of people. It's the same thing, except those people are in real life. But what I am worried about is that somebody might see that video on Instagram and they might think to themselves, what on earth is she doing? And I wonder if maybe you felt that too in a completely different context, or maybe in a similar situation. Perhaps there's something that you've been thinking about for months, or maybe even years. Maybe it's starting a business or changing your career or applying for a new job. Or maybe it's something like joining a new art class and trying something new for the first time. Maybe it's something like writing a book or going back to education. It might be something that seems even smaller, perhaps like speaking up in meetings or posting something online. And I suspect that often it's not that you don't want to do it, but perhaps there's a voice in the back of your mind that's saying something like, what if people think I'm making a fool of myself? And I think that we listen to that voice very easily, but we don't necessarily talk about that voice and the power and the impact that that voice has often enough. Because I think if we're being honest with ourselves, that voice, which we can ultimately choose whether we address and confront and then ignore, can be surprisingly powerful in terms of dictating what we then go on to do or don't do. And when I first started recording videos for Instagram a couple of months ago, I remember standing in my kitchen with my phone balanced on whatever I could find, because I didn't even have a proper tripod for my phone. I didn't think I needed one. I'd record something, I'd watch it back, I'd decide that I looked incredibly awkward, so I'd delete it and then I'd start again. And that process might go on and on and on. And it's such a waste of time. And I'm no video editor. I don't have those skills. And my children will tell me quite frankly that my video editing is poor. And that's probably my version of them being politer than they actually are. So I knew that my hesitation wasn't because I was trying to make a video that looked polished and really professional, because that's ultimately beyond my skill set. So when I dig deep around what it is that's putting me off making those videos, or why I feel like I need to repeat them and record them over and over and over again until I get one that I'm vaguely happy with, I think that I discover that making the video isn't actually the issue. The issue is me thinking about who might see that video and then me imagining what they might think about that video or what they might say about me as a result of seeing that video. And with that, I realized that I wasn't really afraid of strangers on the internet. they didn't bother me as much, mainly because I suppose I haven't been trolled yet. But the people I was imagining who were criticizing my posts and my content were actually people who were much closer to home. So they might be people that I used to work with, or people that I went to school with, or people who knew me from years ago, or maybe just a couple of years ago, people who had a fixed idea of who I am or who I was and that past version of me. And it's funny, isn't it, that a complete stranger could leave a lovely comment and I would very much appreciate that. And I would take that on board and really enjoy that moment. But the possibility of somebody from our past perhaps just raising an eyebrow or having that thought can be enough to stop us from even doing something before we've even started. And so that got me wondering whether the fear of looking stupid is actually about looking stupid at all, or whether it's really about giving ourselves permission to become a different version of ourselves and to step into our new identity while other people are still expecting us to stay the same person that we were from 6 months, a year ago, 5 years ago, whatever it might be. And I think that's one of the hardest parts of any personal change. It's not necessarily learning a new skill, because that can actually be quite enjoyable. And it's not necessarily gently making the shifts and exploring what's possible. It's allowing people to see us learning and experimenting and growing and making mistakes and getting things wrong, because we don't necessarily want people to see those things. And so that's what we can become fearful of. And I'd been thinking about all of this for a few days, and I found myself reading a little bit more about why we feel like this. And I came across something called the spotlight effect. And it's a piece of psychological research by Thomas Gilovich and his colleagues. And the idea is actually very reassuring. As human beings, we tend to overestimate how much other people notice us. We think that everyone saw or heard us stumble over our words in a meeting, or that everybody noticed the typo in our email, or that everybody remembers that awkward thing we said or we did 3 years ago at a party. When in reality, most people are just far too busy thinking about themselves, because they are the center of their own worlds. They're wondering whether they said the wrong thing, or whether they looked okay, and whether people liked them, or whether they're doing a good enough job. And I know it sounds really obvious when I say it out loud, but I found it quite comforting that it had this name and this research base behind it, because it reminded me that the spotlight that I've been imagining is on me isn't anywhere near as bright as I thought it was. And I remember having a conversation with a female business owner a year or so ago who told me that they would love to personally post on social media about their business, but they were worried, genuinely worried about what people might think of them. So I asked her a question, and I said, how much time do you actually spend judging other people's posts? Now, I know she's a busy business owner, so obviously she's not spending a huge amount of time on social media, but her response just made me smile, because she laughed and she said, well, none. And that's the point. Yes, people do judge. Of course, people judge, and there will always be people who judge us. But most of us aren't analyzing every single social media post that we see. And we're certainly not keeping a mental record or database of somebody else's awkward moments or awkward videos from 6 months ago. And yet somehow we imagine that everybody else is doing that to us, exactly that same thing. Isn't it really funny how our minds work in that way? And I know I've talked about this before, but when I think back, some of the biggest moments in my life have all started with me feeling completely out of my depth. Like converting my camper van. That's probably one of the best examples, which I know I keep talking about, but I'm genuinely really proud of this journey that I went on. But when I tell people that I converted Olive's van, they often assume that I knew what I was doing right from the start, that perhaps I had some kind of trade experience, or actually I just supported somebody else who did the work on the van and then I claimed it for my own. But it's not true. I didn't have any trade skills. I've never learned to be an electrician or a carpenter. But what I did have was some basic DIY skills. And I had plenty of enthusiasm, and I had YouTube. And that was about it. Of course, there were plenty of mistakes. I measured things incorrectly. I had cupboards that I've had to take apart and rebuild. I had cuts that weren't straight. I've got units that are wonky. They're not square. And of course, that affects everything. there were decisions that I changed halfway through the build. And if you follow me on Instagram, you might have seen that most recently I created a very pretty starry ceiling that I made from fiber optic cables. And that wasn't in the original build. So I had to take down the original ceiling. Then when I was trying to pull the stretch carpet off, I managed to rip the ply. So I had to get a new piece of ply and cut that. And it became this whole thing. And what I thought would be a relatively quick job, like, a couple of afternoons and evenings, turned into a whole week of work. But of course, with every mistake that I made on that process, I cut the square too big. I had to find a way to fix that. I learnt new skills or new ways of managing that situation as a result of all the mistakes I made. And if you look closely, there are still lots of little imperfections all over the van. And in fact, you really don't have to look that closely at all to see all of the imperfections. And most of them frustrate me hugely when I'm using the van. But every now and then I will notice one and smile, because it shows that I had a go and that I learned something along the way. And if I had waited until I knew exactly what I was doing, until I knew about plumbing and electrics and solar systems and carpentry and woodwork and etc., Olive just simply wouldn't exist. The van wouldn't be there. She wouldn't exist as something that we can use and let people borrow and enjoy making memories in. Because I can't imagine how I would ever have been able to develop all of the collective skills that I would have needed to feel confident enough to have just started, to have known what I was doing, to have actually started building her out in the first place. And I think the same is true of so many things in our lives. I know I've told you this story before as well, if you've listened to all of the podcast episodes, but when Matt and I first became parents, we had absolutely no idea what we were doing. We were both quite young, and I have to admit, I didn't read a single parenting book. And you may have heard the story where we brought Jake out of the hospital when we were leaving. We had this beautiful tiny human who apparently now belonged to us and needed our attention and devotion 24/7. And we couldn't even work out how to fit the car seat into the car. And a complete stranger had to come over and help us to be able to take him home safely from the hospital. And yes, I know I probably should be embarrassed about how totally incompetent we were, but actually that's one of our favorite memories to laugh about now. And it's a great reminder that every single parent starts somewhere. In this case, we probably should have started with a demonstration about how to fit a car seat into a car in advance. But as a parent, you learn, you make mistakes, you ask for help. And over time, little by little, you obviously build the collective skills that you need to hopefully become a pretty decent parent and to set your child up for their version of success in the world. And when I look back, I can see that same pattern everywhere in my life. So learning to swim, which then ultimately took me on this incredible journey to being a competitive swimmer for most of my youth, really, until I was old enough to learn to drive. And then learning photography from scratch to then becoming a wedding photographer who achieved their own goals in terms of the number of weddings, to starting multiple other businesses over the years. None of those things necessarily began because I had confidence or a really deep understanding of the area that I was working in. They began because I had curiosity, or in the swimming sense, I had some good instruction. And that's led me to question something else more consciously than I would have previously. And that is the idea that confidence isn't what gets us started, but what grows as a result of us starting. And I've talked about that before as well, in terms of taking the first action and then getting the confidence from the subsequent actions and building the momentum and providing that evidence that you can do something and that you've shown yourself what's achievable. And I know, again, this seems so obvious when you say it out loud, but I think we all will have at some point thought of confidence as something that people either have or they don't have, especially if we are comparing ourselves to somebody in a specific role or at a particular moment in time, and we're not as far along as they are in a particular journey. So we might look at somebody standing on a stage giving a presentation, or somebody running a multi-million-pound business, or somebody else speaking successfully online. And we might assume that they must have felt confidence and that way from the very beginning of their journey. But it's much more likely that their confidence has been built as a result of collecting enough evidence over time that they can do the thing, small, consistent steps, and then confidence was actually the reward. And as I was reflecting on all of this, I realized that there was another question that I needed to ask myself. And it leads nicely on from what my guest last week, Louise, was saying about what if it's the best thing that you ever did? And my question that I have to keep reminding myself is, what's the cost? And it's not just the cost of doing something that feels uncomfortable, because of course we don't want to feel uncomfortable, but that's how we learn, that's how we grow. But what's the cost of not doing it? Because we all naturally spend time imagining everything that might go wrong. We are intrinsically designed to be pessimistic. It's built into our ancestors' survival. But in this day, we might worry about different things. We might worry, what if nobody listens? What if nobody books? What if I make a mistake? What if people judge me? And they are all very real and legitimate fears to have. But most of us don't necessarily give ourselves time and space to question the other side of that. What if I don't? What if I never start the business? What if I never launch the podcast? What if I never apply for the course? What if I never write that book that's been sitting in my head for years? What if I let the fear of looking or feeling inexperienced make the decision for me not to bother? And this is one of the things that started my midlife shift, because I didn't want to reach older age with regrets and to have those thoughts about what I wish I could have done and what I chose not to do and what fear stopped me from doing. I want to feel brave and courageous, and I want to tackle my fear face on so that I don't get to the end of my life and feel regrets about what I didn't have the courage to do because fear stopped me from doing it. And I think when we think about it like that, the balance starts to shift. Yes, of course, I feel embarrassed when I post things on Instagram. It still doesn't feel natural and comfortable to me. But that embarrassment is short-lived, and not as many people will notice as I think. Very few people follow my Instagram account. It really is nothing that I need to worry about. And yes, there might be a few mistakes, but that is genuinely how we learn. And yes, somebody might think, what is she doing? But does that actually say more about them than it does about you? And of course, all of those moments are temporary. Regret, on the other hand, that has a habit of lasting much longer. And one of the things that I have noticed through recording this podcast is that every single guest that I've spoken to has been courageous in some way. They have all reflected on some of the barriers that they faced, but they have all chosen to take the step anyway. Some are smaller steps, some are bigger steps, some were quicker, some took longer. When I spoke to Sarah Hardacre, she talked about following her curiosity before she had everything figured out. Louise Pittman had followed her intuition to do something that felt far more aligned with who she was. And Sue Tansley knew that it was time to leave a career she loved and the security that came with that career in order to save herself. These women were all brave, but they would all have had doubts. I'm sure they all questioned themselves, and I'm sure they all faced fears, but they still acted. And I don't believe that courage is the absence of fear, but maybe courage is deciding that something else matters more than the fear itself. In Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic, she describes fear as a passenger in a car. And she says that fear is allowed to come along for the journey. It can sit in the passenger seat. It can even complain from time to time, but it doesn't get to drive. And I love that image because I personally think that becoming fearless is an impossible goal for most of us. I know there will always be moments when I feel nervous before pressing publish on a podcast episode or standing up to speak in front of an audience or trying something new that I've never done before or meeting new people. My goal isn't to get rid of fear, but to stop allowing fear to make my decisions for me. Something else that's helped me is remembering how we treat children when they're learning. If a toddler were to fall over whilst learning to walk, we won't say to them, well, that's obviously not for you. You're never going to be a walker. We would expect them to wobble. We would expect them to fall over. And in fact, we would probably celebrate every few steps they've taken because we know that that's part of their learning. And we want to encourage them to take a few more steps until eventually, of course, they learn to walk. But somewhere along the way, we stop offering ourselves that same kindness. We expect ourselves to get things right first time. We think that making a mistake says something about who we are, or that it confirms what we can and we can't do, or what we're good at and what we're not good at. For me, it's darts. Every time I try to play darts, I enjoy it. And my best friends will tell you when we went to a flight club in Cardiff, how stroppy I got because I am just terrible at darts. And so in my head, I've confirmed that I'm not good at darts, but actually I've hardly had any practice and I should probably try it a bit more before I make that decision, because we can't possibly expect ourselves to get things right first time, every time. Of course, that's not possible. We are learning just like children do. And Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset really enforces this. She found that people who continue to grow aren't necessarily the most naturally talented people in those areas. They're the ones who see mistakes as information rather than evidence of failure. And this one especially connects with me when I think about the van conversion, because every mistake taught me something. Mistakes show us what worked and what didn't. They teach us what we would do differently next time, and it becomes part of the learning process. And perhaps that's where self-compassion comes in too. And Kristin Neff has some research that has shown that we're actually more resilient as individuals when we respond to ourselves with kindness rather than criticism. And I wonder, how often do we show ourselves kindness when we make what we perceive to be mistakes ourselves? And then if somebody asks us, would you speak to your friend in the way that you've just spoken to yourself? And of course you wouldn't. If one of my friends told me that they were thinking about starting something new, I wouldn't tell them that they looked ridiculous or not to bother because they'll never learn how to do it well enough. If they were fearful or they thought that some artwork that they'd produced was rubbish, I'd probably remind them that everybody starts somewhere, and it's great that they're learning to do that thing in the first place. But I don't think we always offer ourselves that same level of encouragement and compassion and kindness. And maybe that's something that we could all practice a little bit more. Before I finish, I'd like to leave you with a simple exercise. If it's safe to do so, please grab a notebook or even open the Notes app on your phone and complete this sentence. If I wasn't worried about looking stupid, I would ... And then I'd love you just to keep writing. Don't overthink it. Don't edit. Just keep going until you've got everything out of your head and onto the page. Because I have a feeling that what you write might surprise you. Because sometimes the things that we are most afraid of are actually the things that we most want to do. And they are usually the things that are asking us to be seen, or to be a beginner again, or to risk getting it wrong. If I take us back to that hoodie that started this whole episode, it said, your fear of looking stupid is holding you back. And having thought about this quite a lot, I don't think it's actually fear that's holding us back. It's the decisions that we make because of the fear. Fear in itself is a completely normal human emotion, but it doesn't have to make our decisions for us. The Purposeful Shift podcast has taught me many things over the last few months. I have had conversations with women who have changed careers, started businesses, rediscovered their creativity, rebuilt their lives after loss, and chosen paths that often people didn't always understand. And none of them had it all figured out. None of them have said to me, I felt fearless. But every single one of them decided that the possibility of creating a life that felt more aligned was more important than the possibility of somebody judging them. We only get one life. And I don't know about you, but when I imagine myself 10 years from now, I don't think I will be worrying about whether somebody thought an Instagram reel I posted was awkward or icky or cringy. But I do think I would regret the opportunities that I never gave myself permission to explore. The conversations I never started, the ideas I never shared, the rooms that I avoided because I didn't think I would fit in there. So perhaps this week, instead of asking yourself, what if I look stupid? Let's try asking ourselves a different question. What might be possible if I was willing to be seen learning? Thank you so much for listening to The Purposeful Shift. If this episode resonated with you, you might enjoy our new weekly newsletter where I share thoughts like this and gentle prompts and exercises for you to reflect on. You can find the link to sign up to the newsletter in the show notes or on the Purposeful Shift website. Thank you again for sharing your day with me today. Until next time, please take care of yourself, keep following your curiosity, and remember, Fear will always have something to say, but you don't have to let it have the final word. See you soon.